The night sky above Fort Deliverance burned red. Explosions lit up the atmosphere as human defense turrets desperately tried to hold back the invaders. Captain Elias Bonner gritted his teeth, gripping his rifle tightly. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of burning metal, and the distant screams of his dying comrades. The ground trembled under his boots as another orbital strike hit the outer walls. "This is Bonner. The line won't hold. If anyone's out there, we need immediate backup." He yelled into his comms, but static was the only reply. He turned to his team, 7 soldiers, their armor scratched, blood staining their visors. Sergeant Dwayne Carter, his second in command, adjusted his pulse rifle. "No one's coming, Cap. We hold, or we die." Bonner exhaled sharply. "Then we make them bleed first." A sudden shriek cut through the battlefield noise. The air shimmered, and before their eyes, a towering alien warrior uncloaked, its biomechanical exoskeleton gleaming under the emergency lights. Its 4 razor-sharp arms flexed as it stepped forward, black eyes scanning them like a predator studying its prey. Then it lunged. Bonner rolled to the side as the alien's plasma blade slashed through Carter's chest, splitting him in half. His scream was cut short as his body collapsed in 2 pieces. The stench of burning flesh filled the air. "Tuom taked," Bonner roared, firing his rifle. The other soldiers followed, bullets and plasma bolts streaking through the dark. But the alien moved too fast, dodging and weaving, cutting down another soldier with a single strike. Private Lee Ramirez screamed as the alien's claw pierced his stomach. Blood splattered as the creature flung him aside like a ragdoll. Bonner switched to armor-piercing rounds, aimed, and fired 3 shots. The bullet struck the alien's shoulder, forcing it to stumble. That was all he needed. "Now," he barked. Corporal Jenkins pulled the pin on a sticky grenade and hurled it. The grenade latched onto the alien's chest. Boom! The explosion sent it crashing into a wall, its body twitching before finally going still. For a moment, silence. Then the distant sound of marching. Bonner's heart sank as dozens of cloaked figures flickered into view. The Lablonnamedadon were here in full force. "Fall back," he shouted. They sprinted through the ruined corridors of Fort Deliverance, the walls crumbling around them. Bonner's HUD displayed the colony's status. Over 60% of the settlement was already lost. They were fighting a losing battle. They reached the command center, where the last remaining officers were gathered around a holographic display. General Vasquez, a scared veteran, turned as Bonner entered. "Give me good news," Vasquez demanded. Bonner shook his head. "They're everywhere. Carter's dead. So is Ramirez. We're the last line of defense." Vasquez clenched his fists. "Damn it." He turned to the console and activated the evacuation siren. "Civilians are being escorted to the underground tunnels. We need to hold this position long enough for them to escape." Before Bonner could respond, the lights flickered. A low mechanical hum filled the air. Then the AI-driven drones attacked. Sleek black machines with glowing red sensors burst through the ceiling, their plasma cutters slicing through human soldiers like paper. Screams echoed as men were torn apart, limbs flying, blood spraying against the walls. Bonner grabbed a fallen soldier's shotgun and blasted the nearest drone out of the air. "Take cover," he bellowed. Jenkins, now wounded, crawled behind a barricade. "We're screwed, Cap." "Not yet," Bonner muttered. He pulled out a pulse EMP grenade and lobbed it into the air. A blue wave of energy pulsed through the room, short-circuiting half the drones. They collapsed, sparking and twitching. The survivors quickly finished the rest, but the battle wasn't over. "Sir," a technician called out, "the Lablonnamedadon dreadnought is charging its main weapon." Bonner's blood ran cold. "If they fire that, this whole colony is dust," Vasquez growled. Bonner knew what had to be done. "Then we take the fight to them." He turned to his remaining team. Only 4 of them were left standing. "We're going to board that ship," Bonner said. We disable that weapon, or we die trying. Vasquez gave him a grim nod. You don't have long. That cannon fires in 10 minutes. Bonner loaded his rifle and looked at his men. This is it, he said. One last fight. And with that, they ran toward their fate. The halls of Fort Deliverance shook violently as another explosion rocked the structure. Dust and debris rained down from above as Captain Elias Bonner sprinted through the ruins, his heart pounding like a war drum. His remaining team, Jenkins, Patel, and O'Reilly, were right behind him, their boots slamming against the metal floor. Behind them, the Lablonnamedadon were in pursuit, their cloaked forms flickering in and out of visibility like ghosts in the dark. A plasma bolt whizzed past Bonner's head, melting a chunk of the wall beside him. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. The exit was just ahead, a gaping hole in the structure where a missile had blown apart the wall. Beyond it lay the shattered battlefield, the wreckage of fallen human and alien machines scattered across the landscape. Their only hope was to make it to the underground tunnels before the aliens overwhelmed them completely. O'Reilly was falling behind, limping from a shrapnel wound in his leg. Bonner turned back, grabbed his arm, and pulled him forward. Move, damn it. Jenkins fired over his shoulder, his rifle lighting up the corridor in short, desperate bursts. We can't outrun them forever. We don't need to outrun them, Bonner growled. We just need to get outside. They reached the edge of the fortress and leaped down onto the rubble-strewn battlefield. The colony was in ruins. Burning buildings, overturned vehicles, and bodies littered the ground. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic stench of blood. Overhead, the Lablonnamedadon dreadnought loomed like a monstrous shadow, its main weapon slowly charging, preparing to erase the entire settlement in one devastating blast. Bonner barely had time to register the sight before he heard a familiar, terrifying sound. The Lablonnamedadon assassins uncloaked all at once. They moved like bladed nightmares, their sleek exoskeletons glistening, their quadruple arms brandishing plasma daggers and rifles. Two of them lunged. Jenkins didn't even have time to scream. The first assassin grabbed him by the throat and impaled him straight through the chest with a glowing plasma blade. His body convulsed before the alien tossed him aside like garbage. Patel let out a furious roar and unloaded his entire magazine of the killer. The bullets tore through its armor, sending it crashing to the ground. But before Patel could celebrate, a second assassin swept forward, its claws slicing through his neck. Blood sprayed across Bonner's visor. There was no time to mourn. Go, Bonner roared, shoving O'Reilly ahead. They sprinted toward the entrance to the underground tunnels, a concealed bunker door half buried under debris. O'Reilly dropped to his knees, frantically entering the override code into the panel. Bonner turned to cover him. The remaining assassins advanced like demons, moving faster than any human could react. His rifle was nearly out of ammo. He aimed carefully and fired his last 3 shots. 2 found their mark, blowing apart an alien skull. The third hit another in the shoulder, slowing it but not stopping it. The assassin leaped at him. Bonner barely managed to dodge, rolling across the dirt as a plasma blade slashed the air where his head had been. He grabbed a fallen combat knife and plunged it into the alien's side, twisting with all his strength. The creature screeched and staggered, giving him just enough time to grab its own plasma dagger and drive it through its throat. The assassin gurgled before collapsing. Bonner, let's go, O'Reilly shouted. The bunker door slid open with a hiss, revealing a dark passageway leading underground. Bonner didn't hesitate. He grabbed O'Reilly by the vest and shoved him inside before diving in after him. The door sealed shut just as the last remaining assassin lunged, its plasma blade slamming into the metal an inch too late. Bonner lay on his back, gasping for breath. O'Reilly was slumped against the wall, his hands trembling. They had made it, but at what cost? They had lost everyone. After a few seconds, Bonner forced himself to stand. They weren't safe yet. The tunnels led to the last human stronghold beneath the colony, where the remaining survivors were holding out. If they could regroup, maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance. O'Reilly groaned as he pulled himself up. What now, Cap? Bonner reloaded his weapon. His voice was grim, but there was still fire in his eyes. Now we fight back. The underground tunnel was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of dirt and metal. Bonner and O'Reilly moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows along the narrow passageway. The sound of distant gunfire and muffled explosions rumbled through the ceiling above them. The colony was still burning. The war wasn't over. O'Reilly winced as he clutched his wounded leg, his breathing ragged. How much further? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Not far, Bonner replied, his grip tightening around his rifle. He was exhausted, running on nothing but adrenaline and sheer will. He had lost too many men, seen too much death, but there was no time to grieve. The fight wasn't finished. They had to reach the last human stronghold. A rusted metal door stood at the end of the tunnel. Bonner stepped forward and knocked in a rhythmic pattern. 3 short, 2 long, 1 short. A few tense seconds passed before the door creaked open. A rifle barrel pointed straight at his face. Identify yourself, a voice barked. Bonner didn't flinch. Captain Elias Bonner, 3rd Colonial Defense Division. Open the damn door. The rifle lowered, and the soldier on the other side let out a breath of relief. Holy hell, Captain. We thought you were dead. Not yet, Bonner muttered as he and O'Reilly stepped inside. The bunker was cramped, dimly lit, and packed with survivors, wounded soldiers, terrified civilians, engineers, and resistance fighters. Maps and data screens covered the walls, showing real-time footage of the battle above. It wasn't good. The colony was nearly overrun. General Vasquez stood at the center of the room, surrounded by a small group of officers. His uniform was stained with blood and soot, his face lined with exhaustion. He turned as Bonner approached. Captain, Vasquez said, his voice heavy. I didn't think I'd see you again. Neither did I, Bonner admitted. But we don't have time to reminisce. What's the situation? Vasquez motioned to the holographic display. The Lablonnamedadon dreadnought hovered above the colony, its main weapon nearly charged. Enemy forces had taken control of over 70% of the colony, and the last few human holdouts were barely surviving. If that cannon fires, Vasquez said grimly, we lose everything. Bonner's jaw tightened. Then we stop it. O'Reilly scoffed. How? We barely made it here alive. Bonner turned to Vasquez. Tell me we have something, anything, that can give us a chance. The general hesitated, then nodded toward a corner of the room. We might. Bonner followed his gaze and saw a group of engineers working frantically on a large cylindrical device covered in cables and flickering lights. It looked old, very old. One of the engineers, a woman with grease-streaked hands, looked up as Bonner approached. This is a pre-war Terran AI disruptor, she explained. Built centuries ago to counter AI-driven enemies. It was buried deep beneath the colony, probably left behind by early settlers. We never knew it was here until now. Bonner frowned. And what does it do? If we can get it operational, the engineer said, it'll send out an EMP pulse strong enough to disable all cloaking technology and AI-based systems in the area, including the Lablonnamedadon drones and their ship's targeting systems. Bonner felt a flicker of hope. Then why isn't it online yet? The engineer sighed. It's old. Some parts are missing. Others are fried. We need at least 30 more minutes to get it running. Bonner turned back to Vasquez. We don't have 30 minutes. That ship is about to fire. Vasquez nodded, which is why we need a distraction. We need to buy time. Bonner's mind was already racing. A full frontal assault is suicide. But if we launch a targeted strike at their forward command post, we might draw enough attention away for you to finish repairs. Vasquez didn't hesitate. Then that's what we do. You take a team, hit the Lablonnamedadon where it hurts, We'll get the disruptor online. Bonner looked around at the remaining soldiers. Many were injured. Others were exhausted. But they were all fighters. Survivors. He took a deep breath. All right. We hit them fast. We hit them hard. We give them no time to react. If we fail, everyone dies. He looked at O'Reilly. Can you still fight? O'Reilly smirked. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Bonner turned to Vasquez. Get that disruptor running. We'll handle the rest. 15 minutes later, Bonner and his strike team emerged from a hidden tunnel on the far side of the colony. The night air was thick with smoke and the glow of burning buildings. The Lablonnamedadon Command Center stood ahead, a massive alien structure covered in pulsating energy conduits and guarded by heavily armed warriors. Bonner signaled to his team. It was time. The first explosion ripped through the night, blowing apart an enemy watchtower. The second followed a heartbeat later, sending shrapnel and alien bodies flying. Before the enemy could react, Bonner's team charged. Gunfire erupted. Plasma bolts streaked through the air as humans and aliens clashed in brutal close-quarters combat. O'Reilly took down 2 enemies with precise headshots. A grenade landed near Bonner, but he dove behind cover just in time. The explosion sent dust and debris flying. The Lablonnamedadon fought fiercely, their cloaking devices flickering as they dodged and attacked. But the humans had one advantage. They had nothing left to lose. Bonner slammed his rifle butt into an alien skull, then spun and emptied his magazine into another. Blood and energy sparks filled the air. His team pushed forward, fighting with everything they had. Through the chaos, Bonner saw a massive alien commander emerge from the structure. Unlike the others, this one was clad in heavier armor, its 4 arms wielding twin plasma blades. It locked eyes with Bonner. The battlefield noise seemed to fade. This was it. The alien lunged. Bonner barely dodged the first strike, rolling to the side as a plasma blade sliced through the ground where he had stood. He fired, but the commander deflected the shots with inhuman speed. Then it was on him. Bonner blocked the first strike with his rifle, but the second blade slashed across his arm, burning through his armor. He gritted his teeth against the pain and retaliated, driving his combat knife into the alien's exposed joint. The commander roared in pain, staggering back. Bonner didn't give it time to recover. He grabbed a fallen pulse grenade, activated it, and slammed it against the alien's chest. The explosion ripped through the commander, sending its body crashing to the ground. Silence followed. Then, O'Reilly's voice crackled through the radio. Bonner, the disruptor is online. Bonner looked up. High above, the Lablonnamedadon dreadnought flickered. Its cloaking system collapsed. For the first time in the battle, the enemy was exposed. Bonner grinned, wiping blood from his face. Then let's finish this. Bonner wiped the sweat and blood from his face, breathing heavily as the Lablonnamedadon command post burned behind him. The disruptor had worked. The enemy's cloaking technology was offline, their defenses exposed. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. O'Reilly's voice crackled over the radio. Bonner, you're gonna want to see this. Bonner turned, gripping his rifle tightly as he sprinted toward the top of a collapsed building where O'Reilly was perched with a sniper rifle. The moment he reached him, O'Reilly pointed toward the sky. Bonner's stomach twisted. The Lablonnamedadon dreadnought, a towering behemoth of alien metal and power, was descending toward the colony. Now that its cloaking was gone, it no longer needed to hide. It was coming to wipe out whatever was left of humanity's resistance. Command, this is Bonner. He barked into his comm. The enemy ship is mobilizing. What's our next move? Vasquez's voice came through, tense but steady. The disruptor did its job, but we need to hit that ship now before it unleashes hell. We've got one last shot, Captain. Bonner's grip on his weapon tightened. I'm listening. The colony's old orbital defense cannon is still intact, Vasquez explained. It was decommissioned decades ago, but our engineers think they can reactivate it. It's the only thing powerful enough to punch through that ship's hull. Bonner exhaled slowly. How much time do we have? Not enough, Vasquez admitted. The Lablonnamedadon will realize what we're up to and destroy the cannon before it can fire. You and your team need to hold them off until we're ready. Bonner didn't hesitate. We're on it. He turned to O'Reilly. Rally the others. We make our stand at the cannon. Minutes later, Bonner and what remained of humanity's fighters gathered at the abandoned defense facility on the outskirts of the colony. The old planetary defense cannon was a rusting, towering machine built into the side of a mountain, its barrel stretching toward the heavens. A team of engineers was already inside, working frantically to bring the ancient weapon back online. Sparks flew as they replaced corroded wires and manually rerouted power. The system's fried, one of the engineers muttered. It was never meant to be restarted. Bonner grabbed him by the shoulder. Then make it work. We don't have a choice. The engineer nodded, swallowing hard before getting back to work. Outside, Bonner's team took position along the perimeter of the facility. Barricades were set up, weapons loaded, and explosives planted. If the Lablonnamedadon wanted to stop them, they'd have to fight through everything humanity had left. O'Reilly stood beside Bonner, clutching his sniper rifle. Feels like the final stand, doesn't it? Bonner smirked. Because it is. They didn't have to wait long. A deep, thunderous roar filled the sky as dropships descended from the dreadnought, unloading waves of Lablonnamedadon warriors. Their quad-armed assassins led the charge, cloaking flickering as they rushed forward, plasma blades gleaming. Behind them came towering war beasts, cybernetic monstrosities fused with living tissue and heavy armor. Bonner raised his rifle. Hold the line. The battlefield erupted into chaos. The first wave collided with the human defenses like a tidal wave. Bonner fired in controlled bursts, dropping an assassin mid-leap. To his left, O'Reilly's sniper rifle cracked, sending a high-velocity round through the skull of a Lablonnamedadon officer. The aliens fought with terrifying speed, leaping over barricades, slicing through soldiers with ruthless efficiency. Humans fell, but they didn't break. They fought back with everything they had. A war beast charged the gate, its massive arms smashing through the barricade like paper. Bonner grabbed a grenade launcher from a fallen comrade and fired. The explosion ripped through the beast's chest, sending it crashing down in a heap of fire and metal. How much longer? He shouted into his comm. Almost there, an engineer replied. But we need more power. Bonner cursed under his breath. They wouldn't last much longer. Then the dreadnought's main cannon began to glow. Bonner's blood ran cold. The ship wasn't waiting anymore. It was going to destroy everything. Through the dust and fire, Bonner spotted something, a power relay station at the base of the cannon. A desperate plan formed in his mind. O'Reilly, he called, cover me. Without waiting for a response, Bonner sprinted toward the relay station, weaving through gunfire and plasma blasts. An assassin lunged at him, but he ducked and plunged his combat knife into its throat. It collapsed, gurgling as black blood sprayed from its wound. He reached the relay and yanked open the control panel. The power conduits were barely connected, damaged from years of neglect. He knew what had to be done. He took a deep breath and grabbed the exposed cables. Electricity surged through his body. Agony ripped through him as he forced the connection, manually rerouting power to the cannon. His vision blurred, his muscles spasmed, but he held on. Then, a massive explosion rocked the entire battlefield. Bonner collapsed as the orbital cannon roared to life, its ancient mechanisms groaning as it charged up. Fire. Vasquez's voice boomed through the comms. The cannon unleashed a colossal beam of energy, a blinding spear of light that tore through the sky and struck the dreadnought. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the ship began to crack. The entire Lablonnamedadon dreadnought split apart, explosions rippling across its hull as its core detonated. A blazing fireball erupted, shockwaves tearing through the sky as the alien warship was reduced to debris. The remaining Lablonnamedadon warriors on the ground hesitated. Their mighty ship gone. Their advantage shattered. O'Reilly raised his rifle and smirked. Now it's our turn. The humans charge. With renewed fury, they drove into the enemy ranks, gunning down the now disoriented aliens. Without their ship's support, the Lablonnamedadon forces began to crumble. Some fled. Others fought until the bitter end. The battle was over. Bonner lay on the ground, barely conscious, the smell of burnt flesh in his nose. His hands were blackened from the electricity, his body broken. But he had done it. O'Reilly knelt beside him, shaking him gently. "Stay with me, Cap." Bonner managed a weak smile. "Did we win?" O'Reilly looked at the sky, where the remains of the dreadnought still burned. "Yeah," he said softly. "We won." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, humanity had hope. Smoke filled the sky, rising from the burning wreckage of the Lablonnamedadon dreadnought. The battlefield was littered with debris, alien corpses, and the bodies of fallen humans. The once thriving colony was now a war-torn wasteland. The explosion from the orbital cannon had turned night into day, and for a brief moment, it felt like humanity had finally won. But the fight wasn't over yet. Bonner groaned as he struggled to sit up. His body ached, his hands were burnt from the power surge, and his vision was blurry. He could barely hear over the ringing in his ears, but O'Reilly's voice cut through the chaos. "Bonner, get up, Captain. We're not done yet." Bonner forced himself to focus. The dreadnought was gone, but the Lablonnamedadon warriors on the ground hadn't surrendered. If anything, they were angrier. They had lost their greatest weapon, and now they were going to fight to the last breath. Vasquez's voice came through the comms. "All units, listen up. The enemy is launching a final assault. They know they'd lost the war, but they're trying to take us down with them. This is it. Hold the line." Bonner gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, ignoring the pain. He grabbed his rifle, even though his hands barely responded. The ground trembled as the last Lablonnamedadon forces stormed forward. Hundreds of them, maybe more. Their cloaking devices were useless now, but they still had raw power, weapons, and rage. They weren't here to conquer anymore. They were here to exterminate. Bonner turned to the ragged remains of his team. There weren't many of them left. Most were wounded, exhausted, or out of ammo. But they had come too far to fall now. "Listen up," Bonner shouted, forcing as much strength into his voice as he could. "We end this right here, right now. No retreat. No surrender. This is our home, and we're not letting them take it." A chorus of exhausted but determined voices rose in response. Then the final battle began. The Lablonnamedadon rushed forward in a relentless wave. The humans met them with bullets, explosives, and sheer defiance. Bonner emptied his rifle into the first line of attackers. Bodies fell, but more kept coming. To his right, O'Reilly took down 3 enemies in quick succession, his sniper rifle spitting death. A plasma bolt barely missed his head, scorching the ground beside him. The fight was brutal, chaotic. Hand-to-hand combat broke out as the aliens crashed into the human lines. Bonner dodged a plasma blade and drove his combat knife into an enemy's throat. Another warrior tackled him, and they tumbled to the ground. Bonner grappled for his pistol, pressed it against the alien's skull, and pulled the trigger. The Lablonnamedadon weren't just attacking. They were self-destructing. Some warriors detonated suicide bombs, taking both humans and their own forces with them. Others fought with no regard for their own lives, only destruction. A massive quad-armed warlord emerged from the smoke, its armor scorched but intact. It wielded 2 heavy plasma cannons and a pair of energy blades. It was bigger than the others, stronger, faster. Bonner knew this was their leader. The warlord roared in fury, raising its cannons. A blue energy blast tore through a group of human soldiers, vaporizing them instantly. Bonner didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fallen rocket launcher and fired straight at the warlord's chest. The missile exploded on impact, sending the alien staggering back. But it didn't fall. It snarled and charged straight at Bonner. Bonner barely rolled aside as a plasma blade slashed through the air where his head had been. He fired his rifle point blank, but the warlord's armor absorbed the shots. It grabbed Bonner by the throat and lifted him off the ground, its grip crushing the life out of him. Bonner, O'Reilly's voice cut through the chaos. A single sniper shot rang out. The warlord's helmet shattered. Blood sprayed as the bullet punched through its skull. The massive alien staggered, its grip loosening. Bonner didn't waste the opportunity. He pulled his combat knife and drove it deep into the warlord's throat. The alien collapsed to its knees, choking on its own blood. Bonner yanked the knife free and kicked the corpse aside. The remaining Lablonnamedadon saw their leader fall. For the first time, they hesitated. Then the humans pushed forward. Vasquez's voice rang through the comms. Press the attack. Don't give them a chance to regroup. The final moments of the battle were a slaughter. The surviving aliens tried to retreat, but the humans gave them no mercy. Plasma fire and bullets ripped through their ranks. And then, it was over. The battlefield fell silent. Bonner stood amidst the wreckage, barely believing it. The enemy was gone. They had won. The surviving humans, what few remained, cheered, screamed, cried. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others clutched the bodies of their fallen comrades. The colony was in ruins, but humanity had survived. O'Reilly walked up to Bonner, wiping blood from his face. He looked just as exhausted, just as broken. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse. Bonner looked at the sky, where the remains of the Lablonnamedadon fleet still burned in orbit. "Yeah," he whispered. "We did." The war was over, and humanity had won. The battlefield was quiet now. Smoke still curled from the wreckage of the Lablonnamedadon war machines, and the scent of burning metal mixed with the metallic tang of blood. The ground was littered with bodies, human and alien alike. The war was over, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the battle itself. Bonner stood in the middle of it all, his rifle hanging loosely in his burned hands. His uniform was torn, his body covered in cuts and bruises. He should have felt victorious. He should have felt relief. Instead, all he felt was exhaustion. The wind howled through the ruins of the colony, carrying with it the distant cries of the wounded. The survivors moved through the wreckage, searching for those still breathing. Some called out names, desperate for a response that would never come. Others stood in stunned silence, staring at the destruction around them. Bonner's comm crackled. It was Vasquez. "We're setting up a trade center at the old supply depot," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "If you're still walking, we need all hands on deck." Bonner exhaled slowly. "On my way." He turned and saw O'Reilly sitting on a chunk of fallen concrete, his sniper rifle across his lap. The younger soldier stared at the ground, his hands shaking slightly. Bonner walked over and sat down beside him. "You good?" O'Reilly let out a dry chuckle. "Define good." Bonner didn't press. He just nodded and looked out over the battlefield. "They didn't surrender," O'Reilly muttered after a while. "Even when it was over, they just kept coming." Bonner nodded. "That's what happens when you fight something that doesn't see you as an equal. They weren't just trying to win. They wanted to erase us." O'Reilly looked up, his tired eyes meeting Bonner's. "But they didn't." Bonner smiled faintly. "No, they didn't." They sat in silence for a few more moments before Bonner pushed himself to his feet. "Come on. Vasquez needs us." O'Reilly sighed and stood as well. "Yeah, let's go." They made their way toward the old supply depot. It had once been a simple warehouse, but now it was the closest thing the colony had to a hospital. The doors had been blown open, and inside, doctors and medics worked frantically to save whoever they could. Bonner stepped inside, his boots crunching against broken glass. The moment he did, the sound hit him. Moans of the wounded, whispered prayers, the occasional scream of someone in agony. It was worse than the battlefield. Vasquez spotted him and walked over. She looked just as bad as the rest of them. Dirt-covered, exhausted, but still moving. "We've got more wounded than medics," she said without preamble. "And supplies are running low." Bonner glanced around. Some of the injured weren't going to make it. Others were already gone, covered with makeshift sheets. The cost of survival was written across every face in the room. "We do what we can," Bonner said finally. Vasquez nodded. "I figured you'd say that." He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Hours passed. He helped lift bodies, carried supplies, held down men screaming in pain as medics tried to patch them up. He didn't stop. None of them did. By the time night fell, the trade center was quieter. Not because the suffering had ended, but because those who wouldn't make it were already gone. Bonner stepped outside, letting the cold night air fill his lungs. Above, the sky was still scorched with the remnants of the battle. Burning wreckage from the Lablonnamedadon fleet still drifted in orbit, like fireflies frozen in the void. O'Reilly walked up beside him. He had a bottle of something strong in one hand. Without a word, he offered it to Bonner. Bonner took a swig. It burned going down, but he didn't complain. After a moment, O'Reilly spoke. "So what now?" Bonner didn't answer right away. He looked at the colony, or what was left of it. The buildings were in ruins. The people were battered, broken. They had survived, but survival wasn't the same as victory. "We rebuild," Bonner said at last. O'Reilly scoffed. "With what? Half the colony is gone. The other half is barely holding together." Bonner handed the bottle back. "Then we start with what's left." O'Reilly sighed and took another drink. "You really think we can come back from this?" Bonner looked at the distant horizon. He could still see the fires burning, still smell the ash in the air. "We already have," he said softly. O'Reilly snorted. "You always this optimistic." Bonner gave a tired grin. "Not really." They stood there for a while, listening to the quiet hum of the night. In the distance, the first lights flickered on in the ruins of the colony. Someone had gotten the power running again. It wasn't much, just a single streetlight, casting a pale glow over the wreckage. But it was something. A sign that even after everything, humanity wasn't done yet. They had survived, and they would rise again.